At 7:02 a.m., two Army privates are staring at a radar screen on the north tip of Oahu when something impossible shows up. The return is so large that one of them thinks the machine is broken, but the equipment is working perfectly. There are more than 50 aircraft closing fast from the north, and that number is still climbing as the signal gets stronger. They do exactly what they're supposed to do by picking up the phone and calling it in. The report goes through, and the system works. Yet the officer on the other end of the line tells them not to worry about it. The radar saw the entire attack coming, which raises the question of why 2,403 Americans died anyway. The Opana Point station wasn't some advanced installation, but rather one of 6 mobile radar units the Army had just set up around Oahu. The whole network was still in a training phase, meaning the equipment was new and the operators were barely comfortable with the controls. Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott had no real reason to be there at all that morning because their shift was already over. They decided to stay late to get more practice time on the gear, and that single choice is what made history. At 7:02 a.m., the screen lights up with the largest return Lockhart has ever seen. His first instinct is that something's wrong with the set itself, but the equipment checks out and the signal remains steady. What he's looking at is real, and it's moving south toward Oahu at high speed. Elliott wants to report it immediately and Lockhart agrees, so they call Fort Shafter's Information Center. This was the only place on the island with the authority to act on radar data, and they finally get through at 7:15 a.m., which was 13 minutes after the initial contact. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler picks up the phone as the only officer on duty. He's working his second ever shift at the information center and has almost no training on how radar data translates into an actual air threat. When Lockhart describes the return, Tyler runs through the most obvious explanation he has. A flight of B-17 bombers was expected in from the mainland that morning, so he assumes this must be them. He tells Lockhart not to worry about it and hangs up. The B-17 flight had roughly 12 aircraft, but the return on Lockhart's screen represented 183. Neither man on the call raised that gap, as Tyler didn't ask for a count and Lockhart didn't volunteer one. The call ended in under a minute, and the 40-minute window opened. From 7:15 a.m. until the first bombs fell at 7:55 a.m., the Opana Point station tracked the Japanese formation the entire way in. Every mile of that approach was visible on the screen, yet not a single American fighter was scrambled. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida sits in the lead aircraft of a massive 183-plane formation, and his biggest problem isn't the fuel levels or the navigation. The question burning in his mind is whether the Americans already know he's coming. Japanese naval intelligence identified the radar installations on Oahu long before the mission launched, and the planners of the WWII took the radar threat very seriously during their war games. If the Americans picked up the formation early enough to scramble their fighters, this surprise strike would turn into a bloody frontal assault. Japanese losses would climb, and the damage to the fleet at Pearl Harbor would drop significantly. The radar network on Oahu was never an afterthought, and the Japanese built their entire plan around that single variable. As the formation drops toward the island, Fuchida scans the horizon for any sign of American interceptors. Nothing appears. He tunes his radio to a Honolulu station, playing music to use as a navigation reference, and the signal remains steady and calm. There are no emergency broadcasts and no interruptions to the music, which tells him that nobody below has any idea what's coming. The open sky is sending a message, but he doesn't realize yet how completely the American warning system has already collapsed. At 7:49 a.m., Fuchida gives the order to begin the attack. The 222 signal pulses out to the rest of the formation. There are still no American fighters in the air, and the anti-aircraft guns on the ships below aren't tracking them yet. The world below looks completely still. The first bombs hit the ground at 7:55 a.m. Within minutes, a Japanese torpedo slams into the USS Arizona, near her forward magazine, and the resulting explosion kills 1,177 men almost instantly. This becomes the single largest loss of life in the entire attack. Battleship Row is already burning before most of the sailors on those ships are even out of their bunks. The Japanese pilots later described a sense of disorientation that was just as strong as their relief. They had spent months training for a contested approach where they would have to fight their way in and absorb heavy losses. They expected to drop their ordnance through a wall of American fighter cover, but instead, they flew into empty air and found their target sitting motionless in the water. Fuchida later called the situation a windfall. The pilots who flew that morning said they could hardly believe what they were seeing, or more accurately, what they weren't seeing. Japanese after-action reports focused on the radar failure with specific interest. The Americans had the technology ready, the station was fully manned, and the report was filed. Yet the chain of command still fell apart. That breakdown wasn't just a stroke of luck for the Japanese, because it was the only reason the strike was devastating rather than manageable. Vice Admiral Nagumo eventually pulls his forces back before a third wave can launch. Part of that decision comes from the fact that the element of surprise is gone, and he still doesn't know where the American carriers are located. The oil storage farms and repair docks at Pearl Harbor survived the day intact, and that fact will matter enormously as the war moves into the months ahead. Roosevelt delivers his day of infamy speech the next morning. While the public grieves, the military review is asking a much colder question. The radar worked, the soldiers reported the data correctly, and the phone call was made. So the investigators want to know exactly where the chain broke and who was holding the link when it happened. The Opana Point station tracked the Japanese formation for 53 minutes, which is actually longer than the attack itself lasted. The screen never went dark, and the data never stopped coming. Lockhart and Elliott did everything right by filing their report correctly, and they eventually walked away without a single charge against them. Tyler was never court-martialed either, because the Roberts Commission spread the blame wide enough that no single man had to carry it alone. But the math of the disaster doesn't change. One undertrained officer made one wrong assumption during a phone call that lasted less than a minute, and the result was 2,403 Americans dead. The Japanese pilots who flew that morning said the open sky above Pearl Harbor told them everything they needed to know about the defense. The Americans had built a radar network and trained soldiers to use it, but they hadn't built the system that connects a warning to a real response. Fuchida's formation didn't have to sneak through a gap in the defenses. They flew straight through a gap in the process, and nobody on the ground even knew the door was standing wide open. For more breakdowns of the decisions that changed the course of the war, make sure you're subscribed to the channel.